This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to today's show. If you have not already done so from the very beginning here, please leave us a rating and a positive review and make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening to this. Guys, if you've liked this show for any length of time and you haven't given us a 5-star rating, I don't really know what to do with you. Come on, man. Do me a solid here. Do what you can to support the show. The algorithms love it, blah, blah, blah. But let's get on to today's content because it's award season, guys. I know everyone's got their own award season, but this is award season on Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast, and this is an award show. This is the show where we give out the awards, the hardware for best podcast of 2021. So for us individually, it's been a big year for our podcast, for Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. We've seen explosive growth this year. I know a lot of you were aware of the fact that we're kind of doing this, way bigger than we had before. We're kind of going at it in a very different way. I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but we've seen tons of growth and that becomes a great thing for us, but also it requires a lot more of us and it requires more of our listeners and everything like that. But we're so thankful for the growth that we've seen. We did a ton of interviews this year. I'll be kind of going down through those here in a second. We got new intro, outro music. Basically, if August Burns Red releases a new album, we're going to have new intro, outro music. But, we launched YouTube channel. So a lot of you guys like to kind of visually see, for whatever reason, you want to see this face when it's talking. I have no idea why, but my wife thinks it's okay. But that's all great and all good. But today, we got two big categories, or I guess segments of awards that we're going to do. So the first segment is we're going to be doing awards for Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast, okay? And then we're going to be looking at other shows. But let me just kind of run down the list of awards we're going to be handing out today, and then we will get into the awards themselves. So for Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast, we are going to be doing the hardest episode. It's not going to get any better, guys. I'm so sorry. The hardest episode to prepare of 2021. The best listener suggested episode of 2021, the most offensive episode, and I'll leave the of 2021 because I think y'all get the point. Most offensive episode, most talked about episode, audience's favorite interview, my favorite interview I was most nervous about, audience's favorite episode, and then my personal favorite episode of 2021. So you're going to make sure you want to stick around for that. And then also we're going to go into the other shows. So for the other shows, the categories are going to be most entertaining podcast show, most thought-provoking podcast show, best daily podcast show, best short form podcast show, best long form podcast show, best new podcast show, best new to me podcast show, best podcast show overall, most important podcast episode, and then we are going to give the best award for best podcast episode of 2021. So before we get into the actual episodes, I hear a lot of people talk about how they're getting into podcasts or listening more and all those different things, but they want to listen to more podcasts, which is always a little bit odd to me because I'm like, well, if you want to listen to more podcasts, just listen to more podcasts. But I'm going to give you a few little tidbits to kind of help you with that process. The first thing is, and I talk about this all the time, guys, you've got to listen at more than 1x speed. Okay, so in most of your devices, you can do 1.5 speed or 2x speed. So I listen to every single one of the podcasts that I listen to at 2x speed. So even someone like myself or like a Ben Shapiro, someone that talks really, really fast, your brain will get used to it. I promise. Your brain will be able to catch up. For some of you, it's just going to seem like gibberish at the first time. Like I always notice it whenever I'm listening to a podcast at 2x speed and then someone else is in my car or something like that. I was like, oh yeah, that is pretty fast. But I'm telling you, your brain will get used to it. But also the other thing is don't listen to crappy podcasts. And I mean that about actual shows, but also episodes. So it might be a show that you really like, but the episode's not any good, doesn't really land with you. Just skip those. Just don't listen to those, because if you're a guy like me, you have to check all the boxes and you have to collect all of them, right? And so I want to listen to every single episode from every single one of the people that I listen to, but that's not always going to be good for you to get in as much information as you want to get in. Also, move on to the next podcast after you get the point. I'm using like major air quotes for get the point. So you're listening to an interview. It's a 3-hour long interview. You feel like about an hour, hour and a half into it, you kind of got the gist of it. You got the gist of the interview. You kind of know what they're going to talk about. You know where this is going. You don't need to spend, another 45 minutes listening to the last hour and a half, if you're listening at 2x speed. So once you get the point, go ahead and move on. Unless it's this podcast, that we are the one exception. You have to listen to every single word or else you're a horrible person and I will keep you from listening to the show ever again. And the last thing is just do it every chance you can. Like literally listen to podcasts every chance that you can. When you have normal downtime, like I will put in my Apple earbuds or whatever when I'm, sweeping the floors or working out in my garage or of course mowing the lawn. It takes me several hours to kind of take care of the lawn at our property. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I may have a 3 or 4 hour block of time. That's 6 or 7 or 8 hours worth of podcast if you're listening to it at 2 times speed. So just do it every chance you can. Again, don't make your wife or anyone at work mad, where you're constantly having to pause or, hey, hang on a sec while I, take my earbuds out. But that is how you can make sure you get all that information in and get it all in at a time that you would enjoy. So here's the thing about this year's, the podcast that we're going through. Every year you guys ask me as well, kind of what shows do I listen to? So I always like to kind of keep you updated as to the shows that I listen to. And guys, we will get to the awards here in just a second, but let me go ahead and give you kind of my lineup because I listen, if I calculate it, it's well over 1,000 individual podcast episodes a year. I mean, it is an absolute ton, and some of them are short form. A lot of them are long form, but again, 2 times speed does help. There are a lot of podcasts that I picked up this year. So these are the ones that are kind of new this year to kind of my rotation. So the Unashamed podcast with Phil, Jason, Al Robertson, Dispatches from Afghanistan with Holly McKay, Cooper Stuff podcast with John Cooper, that's the lead singer of Skillet, Just Thinking with Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker, so we had them on earlier this year, Morning Wire, so that's the Daily Wire's morning news show, so it's like 15-minute little tidbits. Then I have the PragerU 5-minute videos. So I've actually watched the 5-minute videos quite a bit, but I'm actually listening to the podcast. And I went back and listened to a bunch of the old ones because, again, it's just 5 minutes or 2.5 minutes if you're at 2 times speed. And then Fireside Chat with Dennis Prager. That is the same Prager of PragerU. Every Friday he does like a half-hour little thing, and so he kind of takes care of business that way. And then the Danger Close podcast. That's Jack Carr's podcast where he has people on to kind of talk about their books, kind of get the behind-the-scenes look on a lot of the books. Now, the carryovers from 2020, these are the ones that I've listened to a lot of these for several years. I have The Briefing with Albert Mohler, Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. That's a kind of a debate podcast over in the UK. And The Briefing, just to go back to that, that's kind of a daily podcast from Albert Mohler. I think he's the president of Southern Seminary and the Southern Baptist Convention and all that. So he does a daily kind of a news and analysis from a Christian worldview. The Village Church Sermons, and so that is Matt Chandler's church down in Dallas. I only listen to the ones that actually has him on there. The Jordan B. Peterson podcast, Bill Burr's Monday Morning podcast. Obviously, Bill Burr is a comedian. Hold These Truths with U.S. Representative Dan Crenshaw, Jocko Podcast, The Unraveling with Jocko Willink and Daryl Cooper, The Ben Shapiro Show, Apologia Radio, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, The Breakdown with James Langford. James Langford is one of our senators here in the great state of Oklahoma, and then Louder with Crowder. And then here's some that I listen to every now and then, or maybe not every now and then, but I just don't listen to every episode. I will kind of skip around a little bit. So I've got the Joe Rogan Experience. I've got Mic Drop with Mike Ritland, The Sword and the Trowel, Building a Story Brand with Donald Miller. That's kind of a marketing podcast. And The Sword and the Trowel is that's a founder's ministry. That's their podcast. The Art of Manliness. I've talked about The Art of Manliness before. Terry Fakes Audio. That is a local pastor here in my community from Crossings Community Church. Can You Survive This Podcast with Clint Emerson, which I was on earlier this year. That was great. And then The Way I Heard It with Mike Rowe. The Way I Heard It used to be all these kind of short form stories, but he's changed it to be more long form type interviews, which I don't really enjoy that as much just because it's not that Mike Rowe's not any good at it. It's just that I already have a bunch of podcasts that do that. I was listening to that one to get those little tidbits, and then he doesn't really do that anymore. So I just kind of catch those here or there. Now, I've given you all that information. I've kept you waiting long enough, but here we go. We are going to get into the awards for Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. So let's go ahead and get into the first one here. And it's not a fun one to talk about. It was the hardest episode to prepare of 2021. And that was episode 234 and that was called Foxhole Funeral, Land in the Quiet. So one quick thing before I get into that, with a lot of these episodes, I'm not going to really go into a ton of detail. I am going to include the links here in the show notes because, I'm trying to make this episode a little bit shorter so you guys can listen to this, but then go and listen to some of these other ones from our show, but also from other shows as well. So let's get back into hardest episode to prepare of 2021. So obviously, if you listen to this show for any length of time, you listen to Your Foxhole. I believe that was episode 104, kind of talking about the men that were in my foxhole. And one of those men was Land in the Quiet. And unfortunately, this year, he made the decision to take his own life. And so it was a tough episode to prepare. It was horrible to record. It was a little bit cathartic to kind of get it out there to everybody, but that was obviously very difficult. because I talk about all the time on this podcast that we need to be intentional in our, relationships and friendships with men, and, intentional with being in each other's lives, and being someone that, you could call at 3:00 in the morning and all those types of things. And to a degree, I feel like I failed Land in the Quiet. I failed a member of my own foxhole. And so having to talk about his funeral, and having to talk about the things that kind of went into that. And then of course, all the things that I wasn't able to talk about on air, things that just would not have been appropriate to talk about with a generalized audience. It was just a really, really hard episode, but I do think it's important. There were some tidbits in there and some wisdom that I tried to share in terms of how you could more specifically be there for your friends, for the guys that are in your foxhole. So I would definitely check that out. And again, all these are going to be in the show notes. So let's move on from that one to the next award, which is Best Listener Suggested Episode of 2021. And that is episode 243, Normalizing Pedophilia, Your Kid's Classroom. So that was a recent one here, and with all the stuff that we saw going on in different people's classrooms, and parents finally paying attention, finally pulling their heads out of the sand, and figuring out what books are in their kids' classroom, what type of, materials are being shown to their kids. The reason why that's the best listener suggested episode is because obviously a lot of people wanted me to talk about it, but specifically there was a man in my community here that was able to get me an email, and I talked about Deer Creek Elementary School, which is literally just a few miles away from my house, and how basically the reading list and what was on the reading list for their 5-year-olds, right? They're kindergartners. And so that was something that I was not aware of. I knew these types of books were around. I didn't know they were in my backyard. And to get an email that was sent to a parent, a concerned parent, and to be able to read that on air, that was easily the best listener suggested episode of 2021. And there's not really a close second. All right. The next one here is the most offensive episode of 2021. And here's the deal. I have this slight tendency. I know this is going to be shocking to a lot of you guys that listen to this. I have this tendency to be a little bit incendiary. I will say things that just come off the top of my head that aren't always the most polished. And also I will talk about things and subject matters that are, way too hot for a lot of other people. So some honorable mentions for this year, episode 213, Choosing to be Offended, UCO Fight Song Edition. I was talking about how they wanted to change the words of my university's fight song because it used the word boy in it, right? As if the word boy was racist and sexist all at the same time. So people were offended by that. Certainly people that I graduated with, they didn't know I was making such a big deal out of it. But you can go back to listen to episode 213 and tell me if I was making a big deal about it. I don't think I did. Also, episode 259, How Christians Should View the Death Penalty and Why Julius Jones Should Be Dead Today. Again, the death penalty is one of those, hot button issues. And specifically, a lot of people in Oklahoma hopped on the Julius Jones bandwagon like, oh, this guy, not only should he not be executed, he shouldn't even be in prison because they watched, a documentary that basically didn't do its due diligence, didn't look at the court reporting and all those types of things, but that was offensive. But if I had to put my finger on one, and I'm going to here, the most offensive episode of 2021 is episode 192, Race in America Part 6, Was Justice Done for George Floyd and Derek Chauvin? Now, obviously, you can tell what that episode was about. This was after the verdict came back, which convicted Derek Chauvin of murder. I went into detail there how I don't think that those charges warranted, or that verdict warranted what happened in that particular situation. I changed where I was even in the middle of 2020, where I felt like Derek Chauvin at that time was in the majority responsible for the death of George Floyd. And I completely flipped after the trial to understand that George Floyd was mainly to be at fault for his death that day. And again, even questioning whether or not Derek Chauvin was given justice during this thing is just beyond the pale for a lot of people, because again, no one's really questioning that George Floyd received justice, because obviously most of these people got the verdict that they wanted, right? They want Derek Chauvin to burn, but we'll see how things go. And I talked about that in the podcast, and I think he's got a great chance at appeal because of all the things that were happening during that trial. But that is easily the most offensive episode of 2021. 192, Race in America Part 6, Was Justice Done for George Floyd and Derek Chauvin? Now let's get on to the next one, which is the most talked about episode of 2021. So a lot of, people that are a lot of episodes were in contention for that. Episode 196 was one of them. Fear porn and mask mandates. So a lot of people were talking about kind of the fear being portrayed by the media, especially with everything COVID-19 related and all these different mask mandates. And then later in the year, I was able to record fear porn and vaccine mandates, because that became something big for a lot of people to talk about. Episode 221 of this podcast, Keeping Babies Alive Just Long Enough to Harvest Their Organs. I was talking about what's going on at the University of Pittsburgh, where they're actually keeping babies alive and keeping their ischemic time and extending that to where the organs can stay warm so that they can take out the organs. Now, these are babies that have been born, and the way they are killed is outside the womb by having their organs removed. So that was obviously talked about by a lot of people. Episode 243, which I've already talked about, normalizing pedophilia, your kid's classroom, but also episode 247, school board hides child rapists in order to pass a transgender student policy. So that is the issues that were going on in the state of Virginia. It led to everything that was going on over there with those elections, those midterm elections, not really midterm elections, but off-year elections that were going on over there. And all those were talked about. A lot of people asked me about them later, sent me messages, the whole 9 yards. But the most talked about episode of 2021 was episode 215, what Christians should think about aliens, UFOs, and UAPs. That's unidentified aerial phenomena. My goodness, the responses I got to this episode. I mean, for a while there, for about a week and a half, every time I went to my inbox for the info at Undaunted.Life inbox, I was worried. Every time I went to my DMs for Instagram, I was a little bit concerned because I would get these long diatribes from people where it's like, okay, they're seeming reasonable, they're agreeing with me, they're talking about a few things, and then it was like, and I've been abducted by aliens myself, right? And here's the thing, I got a lot of jerks for friends, right? I got a lot of guys that would waste my time, make a burner account literally just to kind of throw me for a loop with a DM on Instagram. But these people, for all I could tell, were serious. And you're not supposed to judge people and all that kind of stuff that most of you guys would say, but man, I got more feedback for that particular episode because I felt like what I said there was fairly reasonable. And again, go back and listen to episode 215 to kind of get an idea as to what I said there. But this was around the time the government was releasing the report about the unidentified aerial phenomenon and kind of what that means. And so a lot of Christians were having this attack of, their personal faith because they're like, oh, what if there's UFOs? That's not even described in the Bible, all these different things. And it was just a lot of craziness. And then the thing that was released by the U.S. government was a big nothing burger, which we should have been able to expect from the beginning. But again, that's easily the most talked about episode of this year. Go back and check it out if you haven't taken that down yet. Okay. Episode 215, what Christians should think about aliens, UFOs, and UAPs. Now let's get into the next one here. Audience's favorite interview of 2021. Now, guys, we did a lot of interviews in 2021. We interviewed 36 different guests on this podcast. And some of those guests came on multiple times. Okay. So I'm actually just going to run down very quickly the list of guests we had this year. And then we'll get to the one that you guys thought, that I thought, essentially was your favorite from this year. So it started off with episode 117. That's with John Fobert. He's an expert on kind of what pornography does to the brain. They have episode 179, Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker. Both of those guys work in ministry and pastoring, and they deal a lot with critical race theory. Then episode 180 with Dan Crenshaw. That's obviously, he goes without saying, he's U.S. representative and retired Navy SEAL. Episode 182 was with Stephen Pressfield, the best-selling author. Episode 183, 184, and 226 with Taya Kyle. So she came on, and that's Chris Kyle's widow. She came on to talk about her situation, and she came on to talk about Afghanistan as well. Then in episode 184, we had Jacob Spence. So he was the associate pastor at Grace Life Church in Canada, and I was talking to him when his lead pastor was in jail. Then episode 186 and 224, that's with best-selling author of my favorite book of all time, which is called Fearless, and that's Eric Blem. And so he came on to talk about that book, but also to talk about the Afghanistan series, so the series I did called Botching Afghanistan. Then on episode 187, I had the lead singer of Skillet, John Cooper. And then episode 188 and 222 with war correspondent Holly McKay. Episode 222, I was actually talking to her when Afghanistan was being taken over and she was on the ground in Afghanistan. Then episode 189 with Justin Brierley. So he is the host of the Unbelievable podcast over in the UK. Then episode 193 with John Eldridge. Obviously, you guys know who that is. Episode 194 with Lila Rose. She is the founder of the pro-life organization Live Action. Then episode 197 and 258 with Ephraim Matos. He's a retired Navy SEAL, but also he does a lot with a bunch of crazy situations around the globe now. Then episode 198 and 229 with Michelle Black. She is a Gold Star widow of a Green Beret. We talked about her book, and then she talked about Afghanistan with us as well. And then we had on 210 and 223 Eddie and Andrea, I don't know why I said Andrew, Eddie and Andrea Gallagher. So that's a husband and wife team. So Eddie was the Navy SEAL that was put in prison for something that he did not do. And so I got to talk to both of them about that. Then episode 212 with Pastor James Coates. So that is the pastor, the lead pastor of Grace Life Church in Canada, who was jailed for basically keeping his church doors open. Then we had Michael Felker on episode 214. He is the lead singer of a Christian metal band that does aggressive worship music, and the band's called Convictions. Then on episode 218 with Sam Hazewinkle. Sam is a guy that's in my foxhole, but he was also an Olympian, and he was one of the oldest wrestlers that I can think of to make the world team. So talk to him. Episode 219 was with Daniel Cox. So he did a lot of research into kind of why men don't have friends in modernity. Then on 225, 254, and 255, we talked with Mike Ritland. So Mike Ritland is a retired Navy SEAL, and he's also a dog handler and an author and does a whole bunch of different things in the Mic Drop podcast, which I was on earlier this summer. Episode 227 with Eddie Penny. So Eddie Penny was actually, he's a retired Navy SEAL, a buddy of mine. He was the first interview on this podcast. He was episode 100, and he came on to talk about the situation in Afghanistan. Then we had the co-author duo of Andrews and Wilson for episodes 228 and 235. We talked about their books and Afghanistan. Then we had Eric Maddox. He is the interrogator that found Saddam Hussein. So he came and talked on episode 230 and 252. 230 was more so about what was going on in Afghanistan. Then we have Pastor Ryan Visconti on 232 and 238. He's a pastor out of Arizona. Matthew Lohmeyer on episode 236. So he was the guy that was fired from Space Force for basically coming out saying, hey, we shouldn't be doing all these Marxist things in the U.S. military anymore. Episode 242 is with the great and powerful Rickson Gracie. So he's considered by many people to be one of the biggest pioneers of mixed martial arts and one of the greatest jiu-jitsu fighters ever. Episode 245 with Pastor Matty Montgomery. He's pastor now, but he was also the lead singer of a brutal Christian band called For Today. Then on episode 246, we had Meet Mitch Benjamin. So he was the world champion Kansas City barbecuer. On episode 248, bestselling author Eric Metaxas. On episode 250, Ryan Mickler from Order of Man. Episode 254, Justin Whitmell Early. We had him on to kind of talk about his book about families. Then we had Mark Appel, former number 1 overall Major League Baseball draft pick, on episode 260. Episode 264 with Ryan Burge, where he wrote the book about the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated of the United States, of Christians and all those different things. And then the last one of the year was 266 with Dr. Jonathan McAlatchy. So he's, a evolutionary biologist, but he's also a Christian apologist. So that's the rundown of the year. And I mean, it was just an awesome thing to have all those different people on. And I'm already looking at some of the stuff we have lined up for 2022. You guys are not going to be disappointed. I think we're going to have some, retreads, some people coming back on the show, but then a bunch of new folks. I'm really excited for you guys. But after saying all that, we got to get into the audience's favorite interviews of 2021. I'd be thinking, well, how did you know that? I basically go off the feedback that I've gotten, but I also go off the numbers for those individual episodes. So a lot of people in the audience loved the interviews I did on the Botching Afghanistan series. So that was around the time when Afghanistan was falling and we saw the immediate fallout. So episodes 222 through 232 of this podcast, we were talking to these people doing these short form, ideas as to kind of what's going on in Afghanistan. A lot was said about Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker. That was one from earlier this year. A lot of people were excited about Dan Crenshaw because they love his book. They love the things that he's doing in Congress. A lot of you guys like the interviews with Taya Kyle, kind of getting a different perspective from her. A lot of you had your minds blown by Holly McKay and, hearing some stuff on the ground and some of the stuff she described in her book that she wrote whenever she was on the ground in Syria, whenever ISIS had taken over. Daniel Cox, a lot of people watched that episode when it, came to, why men don't have friends in modernity. I think a lot of people were, interested in what he was saying. Matty Montgomery, I think a lot of you guys were not really expecting to get that much from a guy that you just thought was maybe a knuckle dragging, a lead singer of a metal band. This guy is just a very adept Christian pastor, and I think that was surprising to a lot of you. The short interview we did with Eric Metaxas, and we're working with his team right now to get him back on in early 2022. But the book he wrote, Is Atheism Dead? A lot of you guys sent me pictures and messages saying, hey, you went out and bought that book thereafter. But taking everything into account and looking at everything the way that I did, it seemed clear that the favorite interview of the year was, and actually a guy that came on multiple times, and that's with Mike Ritland. So Mike Ritland came on episode 225, and that's where he talked about the Botching Afghanistan series. And at that point, I had never done a full-on interview with him. We were recording a 2-part that came out for episode 255 and 256 of the podcast. But on episode 225, it was just his short form ideas as to kind of what went on with Afghanistan and how that entire situation got botched. And I swear, you guys absolutely loved the way that he had described the situation. Because here's the thing with Mike, I have to give a language warning every time he comes on my show because he just says what he says and it's not very clean. And it's not always going to be, polite, to baby ears or grandparents or something like that. But this guy says what's on his mind and he brings it in a way that is very calm and calculated, but also incredibly direct. And then the part 2 of the series that we did with him, where we kind of got more into his faith and we got into a book that he wrote this year, kind of about what's going on in America. I was able to push him quite a bit on some subjects while at the same time realizing we were on, limited time. We weren't sitting in front of each other where we could, had 2-3 hours to kind of hash these things out. But a lot of you guys really appreciated the back and forth that Mike and I had, especially on episode 256. And so those are the favorites for you guys for this year, taking everything into account. That's episodes 225 and 256 with Mike Ritland. Now, I'm going to talk about my favorite interview of 2021, and it's a two-part interview, and it's episodes 183 and 185 with Taya Kyle. So whenever I was looking back on this year, that was the very first one that I thought of. Because again, I told you guys before, if I'm going to have a lady on the podcast, because the majority of our audience is men, the majority of the people that we interview are men. If you're going to be a lady on this podcast, you have to be a gangster, right? You got to be a Lila Rose. You got to be a Michelle Black. You got to be a Holly McKay. And certainly Taya Kyle fits that bill as well. And so hearing her perspective and hearing the things that she had to say about her husband, Chris, about the movie that was made, about his life, about his murder, and of all the questions that I asked of people this year, the number one question that I was, nervous to ask the person that I was talking to, but also, interested by how they responded was when I asked her, had she forgiven Chris Kyle's murderer? Had she forgiven the man that murdered her husband and left her without a husband and her children without a father? And I'm just going to save the answer for you. Go back and listen to episode 183 to hear what she said, because at the end of the day, she didn't give me the answer that I thought I was going to get. And after the first interview was over, as soon as, the cameras turned off, I said, hey, Tay, we have to do this again. We have to do this again, immediately. And that's how she was able to come back on so quickly, where we kind of got into some more things, because I could tell she wanted to really go further on some of these subjects. But I truly enjoyed the information that she gave out. She and I have developed a friendship, and, I've been able to support some of the things that she's doing. She's supporting some things with Undaunted.Life. And so she was absolutely my favorite person to talk to this year. And again, that's not to say that she was, miles ahead of everybody else, because there's so many people I could have said were my favorite interview of this year, but that was just the first one that came to mind. Taya Kyle, episodes 183 and 185. Then we have the interview that I was most nervous about of 2021. So this is a little bit weird because, I'm talking to some people that have some pretty decent profiles, people that are in Congress, people that have sold millions of books, people that are, millionaires, people that have these incredible lives that they put in front of them. But there was one interview this year that, as I was waiting for the interview to connect, as I was doing the interview, and also as I was editing it, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I talked to this person. And that was episode 242, and that's with Hicks and Gracie. So again, the category is interview I was most nervous about of 2021. I wasn't really nervous as much as I was starstruck, because for doing jiu-jitsu now for the last 4.5 years and, getting into the history of it, but also being a huge MMA fan, obviously the Gracie family is the first family of mixed martial arts, and certainly the first family of jiu-jitsu, right? And so when I was talking to him after I had read his book, and he was so nice and so accommodating, but it felt like I was talking to a king cobra, right? But one that just wasn't hungry at the moment or something like that. And I'm just like, okay, I don't want to make eye contact because it might be weird. And, I got to ask this question. Now, again, the interview went fine. Obviously, I didn't, I kind of got out of my own way there for a little bit. But I was definitely nervous about that one. And I was super starstruck. And literally several times as I was editing the interview to get it out to you guys, I'm like, holy crap, I talked to Hicks and Gracie. Such a cool guy, such a crazy story about his life. And obviously just the fact that my main hobby is something that he basically helped invent, that his family essentially invented for the rest of the populace of the world, was incredible. So you should definitely go check that episode out if you have not caught it. Now we have the audience's favorite episode of 2021. So these are the episodes that were not interviews. And so the favorite episode for you guys, and this is by a landslide, really, is episode 176. And that's Contemporary Worship Music is for Women and Effeminate Men. Now, this is an episode that I said early on in my podcast, in the single-digit episodes, that I was going to record an entire episode about contemporary worship music and how it's a problem and, how it creates issues for men. And I just didn't do it, and I kept putting it off. And so 3 years later, I finally got around to it. And so a lot of you guys have made reference to this podcast. When I have people reach out to me to ask me questions, or, people that are donors, a lot of people go back to this episode. They're like, I've constantly thought, while sitting in church, that something was wrong with me because I wasn't into the music. And I didn't think it could have been anything else. So I just assumed there was a big me problem. And so that is the most talked about episode. When I go on other people's shows, if they look back at the log for the year, that's one of the ones that they pull out, because it is a little bit of an incendiary title, because I'm basically calling out contemporary worship music as a whole. And you're not really supposed to do that as a Christian, but that's easily the audience's favorite episode of 2021, 176, Contemporary Worship Music is for Women and Effeminate Men. Now we've got my favorite episode, my personal favorite episode of Undaunted Life, a Man's Podcast of 2021. But here's the deal. This is my podcast. This is my award show, so I'm giving out 2 awards here, okay? And you can't say anything about it because it's mine. What are you going to do? Vote me out? It's my island, all right? I'm the only one that lives here. But the 2 episodes this year that are my favorites are episode 190, We're Going For It, and episode 257, How to Engage Pro-Abortion Arguments. So let's talk about the last one first. 257, How to Engage Pro-Abortion Arguments. So I took essentially all the times I had previously talked about abortion on this podcast, right? Back, I think I talked about it first on episode 6 of this podcast, and several other times with news stories or with argumentation. I kind of coalesced all that together into a bit of a magnum opus, which was basically, I was giving you guys the arrows that you could shoot at these horrible pro-abortion arguments that we see in society and that you might see in dyadic conversations with people that are in your life. Took a ton of time to prepare that. Right. I actually presented that same information to my Sunday school class. That is something that I do go around, and I, can speak to churches on this particular subject of how to engage pro-abortion arguments. And so I gave you guys a peek behind the curtain as to kind of the things that you're able to do. And it's a long podcast. It is a dense podcast, but there's so many nuggets in there that are important for you. So guys, again, if you claim to be pro-life, but you don't understand how to respond to most pro-abortion arguments, you've got to be able to respond to it in a positive way. Go back to episode 257 and check that out. But episode 190, I gave you another peek behind the curtain. That's episode called We're Going For It. Because I had kind of told you that Undaunted.Life up to that point had been, and this was early this year, early 2021, Undaunted.Life had been a thing that was important, a thing that I spent a lot of time on, but it wasn't an immediate thing on my mind. There were other things that were on my mind. I was just kind of like, hey, let's just do one podcast a week. Let's make sure it gets out there, and then just it kind of is what it is. But we drew a line in the sand. And I talked about on that episode of kind of what we're going to do with Undaunted.Life and how we're going to absolutely put everything that we have behind it to grow it as big as possible, to grow the kingdom as big as possible, and to have an impact on men all over the globe to equip them to be able to push back darkness. And so if you want to get away from maybe some of the news commentary or something like that, go back to episode 190 and just kind of hear directly from my brain and from my heart why we're doing what we're doing and what we intend to do as we move forward in the future. Because that was episode 190. That was 70 episodes ago or something like that. But that is something that is very, very important for all of you to understand why this is happening. Because a lot of times you're listening to a show or reading a book, you don't really know why you're reading it. You don't really know why they wrote it. But I really give you all the detail as to why we're doing what we're doing and why we're expanding in the way that we're expanding, which gets into, why do we have ads, and, why are we selling t-shirts? Why don't we just give them away? And why are we doing 2 podcasts a year or a week rather than just 1? And we get into a lot of that information. So guys, my favorite episodes of 2021, episode 190, We're Going For It, and episode 257, How to Engage Pro-Abortion Arguments. That wraps up the awards for Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. Now we need to get into the other podcasts that aren't mine and give those awards out as well. So we're going to go decently quick here, but the most entertaining podcast of 2021, and I believe this was last year's winner and the winner the year before that, it's Bill Burr's Monday Morning Podcast. So Bill Burr is a comedian. He's a little bit irreverent. He's not the cleanest guy, any of those types of things, but I can just go brain dead and listen to him kind of talk about the news or talk about things that are coming up, and I can roll my eyes at different points, and then I can hold my belly and laugh at different points. It's just an entertaining podcast to pass the time. Most entertaining podcast of 2021, Bill Burr's Monday Morning Podcast. Then we have the most thought-provoking podcast show of 2021, and that's the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. So Jordan Peterson, he kind of made a little bit of a resurgence this year. He got beyond some of the health issues that he was having. So he had more people on his show. He did some interviews. He did some solo episodes. He's going to be going back out on tour early in 2022. But every time I listen to the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, it was incredible the amount of material that would be in just a hour and a half or 2 hour long podcast, an interview that he did with somebody else. A lot of thought-provoking material. It's great. If you're not listening to it, you definitely should be. The next one is the best daily podcast show of 2021, and that's The Briefing with Albert Mohler. So I mentioned that earlier. This guy, he brings the news and events from a Christian worldview, and that is typically the very first podcast I listen to every single day, Monday through Friday, because it helps me kind of synergize the information that I'm getting from, television news or Twitter or, the stuff that's sent to me or texted me or something like that. And I can look at it through the prism of the Christian worldview, because there aren't a whole lot of shows out there that are doing that, specifically that are also keeping you up to date on things that are going on in the news. So that is the best daily podcast show of 2021, The Briefing with Albert Mohler. Then we have the best short form podcast show of 2021. And so for me, that's PragerU 5-minute videos. So a lot of you guys, like I said earlier, you're watching these 5-minute videos already on YouTube. I mean, they've been played over 1 billion times combined. These are incredibly dense topics that they're talking about, and they're talking about everything. They're talking about Marxism, critical race theory, economic theory, presidential races, pipelines, oil and gas. Like they're talking about everything on that, but it's these experts that are giving you these 5-minute little snippets as to kind of what you could think about a certain issue or a certain thing that happened in history. And so in terms of a short form podcast, and like I told you, I went back and listened to ones from years and years and years ago. It's a 5-minute podcast. For you guys that don't have time for anything, I'm so busy, blah, 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 and all this crap, it's 5 minutes. If you listen to it at 1 time speed, which again, listen to it at 2 times speed, it's 2.5 minutes. It's the best short form podcast out there that I found. All right. The best long form podcast of 2021 is the Joe Rogan Experience. So it's kind of hard to go with anybody else because he basically owns this space, because to a certain degree, he also invented this space. These 3-hour-long conversations with these people where you can really dig into the issues or dig into their book or dig into their past or dig into kind of the things that they're doing. That is the Joe Rogan Experience. Now, I don't listen to all of them. There's several that I skip because the person's not that interesting. The subject they're talking about isn't that interesting to me, or, it's Snoop Dogg and they're just going to smoke weed and talk about, hip hop the entire time. There's some that you can just skip and it's not really that big a deal. But if you're looking for a long form podcast show to listen to, it doesn't really get much better than the Joe Rogan Experience. So that is the best long form podcast show of 2021. Now, the best new podcast of 2021, something that wasn't in existence in 2020 or prior, is Morning Wire. So that is the daily show from the Daily Wire. So this is like 11 to 15 minutes. And it's a very, it's released Monday through Saturday, and it is just the news. Right now, again, with it being the Daily Wire, some of this news is going to come from a conservative bent. The one complaint I would have about the show is they try to make it sound conversational when you can tell it's scripted. These people know exactly what they're going to be saying. So it's gotten a lot better since it first started. But guys, if you were just wanting a quick hit of the news with basically almost no commentary whatsoever, I don't think you can go wrong with Morning Wire. Again, even if you're not conservatively bent, a lot of people could listen to Morning Wire and not really be able to pull out the political leanings of the hosts. Now, there are certain times where it's like, okay, that's more of a conservative point that they're making here as opposed to a liberal point or a leftist point. But again, if you're just looking for something that's just going to give you the news in a quick hit, that is the best one. So the best new podcast show of 2021, Morning Wire. Then we got the best new to me podcast show of 2021. So this is a podcast that existed, but it's just something that I hadn't been listening to. And that's Unashamed with Phil, Jason, Al Robertson. So the Robertson family, obviously that's a family from Duck Dynasty. A lot of you guys know them. But the Unashamed podcast is Phil, who's the patriarch of that family, and his 2 sons, his oldest son, Al Robertson, and Jace Robertson. And typically they're talking about their family. They're talking about things that have been going on. They're kind of sharing funny stories. But then these guys are doing serious Bible study, right? So right now they're working through the book of Matthew. Earlier this summer, I think they were going through the book of John. I mean, it's one of those things that it's crazy to see a family that is so famous, that has made so much money, but they're very, very simple people. And for me individually, earlier this summer, I actually got to be a guest on that show. So I went down to West Monroe, Louisiana. I went to the studio, which is in, Phil's basically duck hunting shop and those types of things. And we did an interview. And so it was just such a cool experience for me to be on that show individually, but it's such a fun thing for me to listen to because, again, the first third or half of it is going to be them kind of just cutting up and having a good time, but then they get into the serious nature of the gospel, which, again, in the time that I spent with Phil Robertson and just seeing how marinated that man is in the gospel, it's an incredible thing. So great show, but that's the best new to me podcast show of 2021, Unashamed with Phil, Jason, Al Robertson. Now, the best podcast show overall of 2021. So this is what I would say is the best, all things considered, show of 2021. In 2019, I said it was the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. In 2020, the winner was the Joe Rogan Experience. And this year, I'm giving the award to the Ben Shapiro Show. The reason is because that's a daily show that I listen to Monday through Friday. I basically listen to it on my lunch break. Obviously, Ben Shapiro is maybe the most dominant conservative voice. I mean, he's up there with maybe a Sean Hannity or a Mark Levin or a Tucker Carlson or something like that, but he's doing it differently. Most of those guys I just mentioned, they do their radio program stuff, but they're hosts on Fox News. This is a guy that's building his own thing. He's releasing a book every single year. But on the Ben Shapiro Show, you got the Sunday conversation where he brings people on for a little bit more long-form interview type things, but then he's giving his analysis throughout the year. And 2021 was a crazy year, right? Obviously, we had the stuff that went on on January 6th. We had, Joe Biden, who's basically a dead person that's in charge of the White House. We had, the issues with still the rioting and COVID-19 and, some of these big court cases that people were talking about with Rittenhouse and with Derek Chauvin and all these different things. And it's always good to come back to somebody that has a conservative bend, but is wickedly smart and gives you the information that you need to know in order to make your own decision as well. Now, he's going to point you in the conservative direction, but overall, I just couldn't think of a better show if you could only listen to one show of this year. That's kind of how I look at kind of giving this award, but the best podcast show overall 2021 is The Ben Shapiro Show. Now let's get into the most important podcast episode of 2021. So I got a couple of things that I would leave you with. So most important podcast episode of 2021, and then the best podcast episode of 2021. So the most important is actually an episode that was on 2 separate days, but they could be combined. And it's 2 episodes from the briefing with Albert Mohler. Okay. So one is from Wednesday, December the 1st, and then the other is Thursday, December the 2nd. So these were on back-to-back days. So I just kind of look at them as a two-parter of the same episode. Now, on Wednesday, December the 1st of 2021, on part 1, he talks about how December the 1st of 2021 is a day that will go down in history as the Supreme Court hears the most important abortion case in a generation. Part 2 of that episode, he talked about the history and constitutionality of abortion and the debate in American public life, what led to Roe v. Wade in 1973, and how did we get to Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization in 2021. And then in part 3 of that episode, he talked about, is there a religious basis for abortion rights? And the religious left contends for the right to terminate the unborn. It was a tremendous breakdown. Like, again, to have, one win the most important podcast episode award this late in the year, it had to be something, because I don't really, play into recency bias, but that was the first one that was on December the 1st of 2021. And then on Thursday, the very next day, December the 2nd, in part 1, he talks about Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey and how it haunts our country. Also, some of the most clarifying words in Supreme Court history. In part 2, he talked about precedent and the woman's right to an abortion, and a look at the pro-abortion movement's 2 major arguments in favor of upholding Roe and Casey. Part 3, he talks about the power of argument, why abortion rights supporters consider yesterday's oral arguments, that would have been from December 1st, a disaster for their movement. Part 4 of that episode, he talked about defining the modern age, the right for a woman to kill life within her. And then in the last part, he talked about the U.S. Solicitor General who made the arguments for abortion before the Supreme Court on December the 1st was appointed by President Joe Biden, and basically talking about how elections have consequences, every election, every single time. So those 2 episodes, again, if you're a pro-life person and you're not just, pro-life for a bumper sticker or a t-shirt, but in reality, and you've done a lot of thinking intellectually around those 2 topics, or around the topic of being pro-life, especially if you're a Christian that believes in the Imago Dei, those are absolutely essential episodes. Those are episodes that you should listen to, save, listen to them again, listen to them once a month. Those 2 episodes are very, very important. He basically took 2 days to not talk about a single other issue other than the case that was being brought to the Supreme Court. So I would definitely suggest you guys take that in. So the most important episodes of 2021, the briefing with Albert Mohler, Wednesday, December the 1st, and Thursday, December the 2nd. But now we're going to get into the last episode, or the last award rather. So this is the best podcast episode of 2021. So of all the podcasts that I listen to, here is the number 1. But before I get there, I'm going to give you some honorable mentions, some ones that if you're already listening to these but maybe missed them, you should go back and check it out. So the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, on episode 11, he had Abigail Schreier on March the 21st. On episode 13, he had Jocko Willink on April the 5th. And then Yeonmi Park on episode 26. That's from May the 31st of this year. She's the gal that escaped from North Korea. But also on November the 4th, he had one called Exploring the Pareto Principle. I thought that was very, very fantastic. Then on the PragerU 5-minute videos, on April the 26th, they had one called What is Critical Race Theory? And on June the 7th, they had one called Are Fathers Necessary? Both of those were incredible. On the Lex Friedman podcast, I haven't mentioned that before, but he actually had John Danaher, basically the godfather of modern jiu-jitsu, I would say. He had him on May 9th. That's episode 182 of the Lex Friedman podcast. I kind of like Lex Friedman's interview with John Danaher better than the one that he did with Joe Rogan this year. I thought he did a better job. And then on the Ben Shapiro show, he had a episode on June the 12th that he put out called Debunked Pro-Abortion Propaganda. And so he was able to kind of debunk in a short form a lot of the propaganda we see from pro-abortion folks. And then on episode 1382, A Society Without Men is a Dying Society. That's one from November the 23rd. And then kind of, in the same vein as some of the other things I talked about this year on the Matt Walsh show on August the 24th, episode 782, it's called There is a Conspiracy to Sexualize Your Children. And so that goes in line with a lot of stuff that I talk about personally when it comes to the normalization of pedophilia. Then on the Joe Rogan Experience, he had a lot of great people on. this year that you can name. But this is where we're going to kind of get to the end. This episode was an episode I literally listened to yesterday. So I'm recording this on the 15th of December. Okay. I listened to this episode yesterday. And this episode almost became my winner. I had already prepped this episode. It was ready to go, ready to record. This almost became my winner for overall podcast episode of the year. But the thing about it is I don't want to have a recency bias. It's an incredibly important episode that you have to listen to. I'm going to put it in the show notes, but here's my honorable mention for best episode of the year, podcast episode of the year. That's the Joe Rogan Experience, episode 1747, Dr. Peter A. McCullough. And so the thing with this particular episode is this is a guy who's one of the foremost published scientists and doctors on the planet. He's been all over the COVID-19 stuff, and he has basically been snuffed out by the mainstream media. They don't have anything to do with him. A lot of his testimony before Congress has been taken down off of YouTube. You have to go listen to this episode, okay? This guy is dropping knowledge about COVID-19 left and right. It was kind of interesting because every time Joe Rogan would ask a direct question, he was basically answering the question that he wanted to answer, not necessarily the one that Joe Rogan was asking. And so Joe Rogan had to repeat himself several times. But there were some big things that he claimed. And again, he's got all the credentials on the planet to make claims like this. But in this episode, he essentially said that you can't get COVID-19 for a second time. He said it's impossible. He says there's no such thing as asymptomatic spread of COVID-19. And then the third thing that I remembered from this episode, and I'll remember forever, is that testing for COVID-19 has a hard time distinguishing between the flu and COVID-19, which if you look back at 2020, how we had like 10,000 people that got the flu as opposed to over 1 million, but we had all these COVID cases. It's like, oh, it's maybe because COVID's stronger than the flu, or maybe it's because everyone's wearing masks and this is great. This guy says no dice on that. And again, you can fact check a lot of things that he said. This guy has credentials literally coming out of his ears. It was such an important interview, especially for the time that we're living in right now. So you guys should definitely check that out. Episode 1747, Dr. Peter A. McCullough. And that's going to be in the show notes. Again, you can only listen to it via Spotify. But here we are. We're going to get to my winner for the best podcast episode of 2021, and that is the Joe Rogan Experience JRE MMA show number 99 with Francis Ngannou. So Francis Ngannou is currently the heavyweight champion of the UFC. And when he came in to talk to Joe Rogan, I was like, okay, this is kind of cool, but Francis, he doesn't really talk trash. He's more of a soft-spoken guy. But for 3 hours, they get into how in the world Francis Ngannou came to be the heavyweight champion of the world. And let's just say it wasn't a straight line. This guy was working in the salt mines in Africa, and they spent a good chunk, probably over an hour, talking about the several times that Francis just tried to escape to get to Europe, tried to escape the country that he was living in to get to Europe, almost dying. He's enormous, so you can't hide this guy anywhere, being shot at, being in these horrible conditions, how he was homeless once he did get to Europe, how he eventually got into fighting, how he eventually got specifically into MMA, how he got to the United States, how he got to the UFC. And again, I'm a huge UFC fan. I'm a huge MMA fan overall. This was such a great interview because Joe Rogan was just mouth open, shocked for much of this interview, because a lot of the things that Francis Ngannou was saying, we already kind of knew some of the details, but when he got into the actual details, it was just completely mind-blowing. And I don't want to set this interview up inappropriately. I'm going to give it to you in the way that it is. So guys, if you missed JRE MMA episode for number 99 with Francis Ngannou, go check it out. It's in the show notes. That is my winner for the best overall podcast show of 2021. So guys, thanks so much for listening to the entire episode. I'm so glad that we got to this point. Thank you again to everyone that listens to our show and everyone that supports our show, sends our show out to more people, shares it, leaves us positive reviews. You guys are why we're able to make this happen. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness. And we do that with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So the links I've got for you today, I've got the links for all of the shows that I gave awards for Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. So every single ones that I mentioned earlier, that is here in the show notes, including my favorites and the best overall for the year. And then also for the other podcasts, I've got them listed here, but then I've got links to the most important podcast episode. That was the 2 parts with the briefing with Albert Mohler. And then I've got the 2 that I mentioned with the Joe Rogan Experience, the one with Dr. Peter A. McCullough and also with Francis Ngannou. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to the show. We do appreciate it. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a 5-star review. If you want to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's INFO @Undaunted.Life. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok and like us on Facebook. And you can check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. We also want to thank the band August Burns Red for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Cutting the Ties, which is off their 10th anniversary re-recording of their album Leveler. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.